At a high-end jewelry store in Riverton, a young black teenager happily searched for the perfect gift for his little sister. But the moment he stepped into the store, that joy was immediately shattered by the suspicious gaze of the female staff member. When he accidentally dropped a bracelet, suspicion quickly turned into baseless accusations. Just minutes later, the police arrived, blindly trusting the staff member's accusations and immediately cuffing him. But what they didn't expect was that this teenager had a powerful ally, his father, a notorious Mafia boss, and he was about to turn the tables in a way no one could have imagined. Jalen Carter, the 17-year-old black teenager, had grown up under the shadow of his powerful family, and had also come of age surrounded by the wary and watchful eyes of those around him. No one in Riverton was unaware of his father, Dominic Carter, a feared and influential Mafia boss. People respected, feared, and even trembled when his name was mentioned. But to Jalen, his father was simply a stern, strong man who always protected and sheltered his family at all costs. Though he grew up in a world where violence, power, and money could buy anything, Jalen had always longed for a path of his own. His heart nurtured small, simple, but pure and honest dreams. He always hoped that one day he could escape the enormous shadow of his father, to live a life he truly wanted, a life without power, without threats, and without the constant fear that loomed over everything. And today, Jalen decided to do one of the simplest yet most meaningful things in his life: to buy his little sister Aaliyah, the person he loved most in the world, a birthday gift all by himself. This year, Aaliyah was turning 10. For Jalen, his sister was the warmest light in a life filled with darkness. She was always innocent, pure, and the only thing she was looking forward to on her birthday was a small, pretty silver bracelet she had once seen through the window of Belmont Jewelers, the most famous jewelry store in town. Jalen knew that with just one phone call from his father, the bracelet would be delivered straight to their door. No one dared refuse Dominic Carter. But this time, Jalen didn't want to do that. He decided to use the money he had saved up from working long hours at a small cafe near school, where no one knew he was the son of the most powerful Mafia boss in the area. He wanted his gift to be the result of honest work, the sweat he had earned on his own, with no trace of his family's power or wealth. He spent almost 4 months working hard. Every day after school, Jalen would rush to the cafe, saving up every little tip. But he never complained because each penny earned made Jalen feel happy, meaningful, and proud. It was the first time he understood that the value of money wasn't just in the amount, but in how it came to him. That day, under the warm afternoon sun of a weekend, Jalen tightly grasped his old but valuable wallet and walked determinedly towards Belmont Jewelers. Inside the wallet was all the money he had saved. In his passionate heart, this simple birthday gift was not only for his little sister, but also a strong statement to himself that he could live, grow, and be respected by others, not because of his family's reputation, but because of who he truly was. However, Jalen didn't expect that, from the very moment the luxurious glass door swung open, his small and pure dream would collide head-on with deep social prejudices. That was the beginning of a tense and intense ordeal he would never forget in his life. As the heavy glass door of Belmont Jewelers gently closed behind him, Jalen immediately sensed a noticeable change in the atmosphere. The warmth of the sunlight outside was quickly replaced by an invisible chill, emanating from the scrutinizing eyes that discreetly turned toward him. Jalen paused for a brief moment, his heart faltering slightly. He was used to these kinds of looks since he was young, curious, cautious gazes mixed with discomfort and wariness. But this time was different, because Jalen wasn't here as the son of a powerful Mafia boss. He was here as himself, a black teenager, simply dressed in an old hoodie over a neatly pressed polo shirt. This time, he wanted to prove his worth, independent of his name or the power behind it. The luxurious jewelry sparkled under the white lights, displayed in transparent glass cabinets, exuding a dazzling radiance that also felt distant and unattainable. Jalen walked slowly toward the back of the store, his gaze fixed on the silver bracelet, the one his sister had long wished for. Behind the counter, Margaret Whitmore stood straight-backed, her sharp eyes fixed coldly on Jalen. Margaret wasn't young, but she still carried the air of arrogance that came with serving wealthy, aristocratic, and well-mannered clients. Yet, her pride was tempered by a deep-seated prejudice, one that had been formed over years of only seeing wealth through the lens of race and social class. To Margaret, an ideal customer was someone with white skin, well-dressed, polite, and carrying thick wallets and expensive credit cards. And Jalen, the black teenager in simple clothes, clearly did not fit her standard. Margaret's gaze narrowed slightly, and the corners of her lips curled into a cold, indifferent smile. Every small movement Jalen made was scrutinized by her sharp eyes. Her hand rested on the polished glass countertop, tightening into a fist, and her red-painted nails tapped impatiently on the counter. This was a clear signal to the other staff in the store. Watch out for that boy, the one who doesn't belong here. Jalen felt her gaze, but tried to remain calm. He walked to the glass display, stopping politely, his eyes full of hope as he gazed at the dainty silver bracelet, neatly placed on a soft black velvet cushion. Jalen took a deep breath, then spoke politely but clearly, "Excuse me, could I see that bracelet?" Margaret didn't respond immediately. She eyed him closely, scanning from his worn sneakers up to his simple hoodie, her voice laced with doubt as she spoke. "That bracelet is very expensive. Are you sure you want to see it?" Jalen clearly heard the hidden meaning in her words, the subtle but open suspicion. His hand tightened in his pocket, brushing against the wallet containing the money he had worked so hard to save. He gently pulled out the wallet, opened it slowly, and let Margaret see the neatly stacked cash. "I'm sure I've saved enough money," he said. Margaret's gaze faltered for a moment, surprised, but quickly turned colder. She didn't like the confidence he displayed, especially from a boy like Jalen. Reluctantly, she moved from her position, approached the silver bracelet, and took it out of the display with an air of caution, placing it firmly on the counter as if to warn him. "Be careful with it. It's worth more than you think." Jalen quietly picked up the bracelet, handling it as carefully as possible, feeling the gentle weight and the cool, pleasant touch of the item. This bracelet, he knew, wasn't just a gift for his sister. It held a deeper meaning. It was a symbol of the pride he felt for the honest money he had earned, and the small, pure dream that was his. But when he looked up, he met Margaret's cold, suspicious gaze that hadn't left him. That look felt like a warning, a silent challenge, as if to say, "I'm watching you. One wrong move, and I'll expose you." And at that moment, standing amidst the glittering but cold luxury of the store, Jalen suddenly realized that the thing he had feared the most was starting to unfold. The small, innocent gift he had meant for Aaliyah was now fragile, caught between two opposing forces, his own sincere purity and the harsh prejudice from the woman before him. Jalen took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure and politeness, hoping everything would pass quickly. But little did he know, this tension was just the beginning of a series of tragic events that awaited him ahead. Jalen struggled to keep his hand steady as he gently turned the silver bracelet over his fingers, but Margaret's cold gaze was like an invisible blade, slicing away at the fragile confidence he had. Sensing the atmosphere growing heavier, Jalen decided not to prolong this any further. He gently placed the bracelet back on the counter, met Margaret's eyes directly, and spoke in a quiet but firm tone. I really like this bracelet. I'll take it. Margaret didn't nod or show any usual joy at making a sale. Instead, she paused for a few seconds, scrutinizing Jalen with a look that seemed to pierce to the core of his being, before she elevated her disdain to a whole new level. "Really?" Margaret sneered, her voice dripping with skepticism. "Are you sure you're not just trying to impress someone with money of dubious origin?" Jalen could clearly hear the malicious intent behind her words, and his heart sank, tightening as if someone were squeezing it. Her words were too sharp, each one emphasizing the harsh prejudice he had always tried to avoid, that a black teenager like him couldn't earn money in an honest way. Keeping his calm as best as he could, Jalen replied softly, "I work at a cafe near school every day after classes. Every penny I've earned is from my job. I have no reason to lie." Margaret let out a dry, mocking laugh, full of contempt. She tilted her head, her eyes still glaring with suspicion, even more intense than before. "A cafe? Don't joke with me, boy. You really think I'll believe this fairy tale? People like you usually only know how to make money through shady means." Margaret's words were like a bucket of cold water thrown straight at Jalen's self-esteem, causing a surge of anger to rise in his chest. But Jalen knew that if he lost control now, that anger would only confirm Margaret's malicious suspicions. He took a deep breath, forcing his voice to remain calm. "I just want to buy this bracelet with the money I earned myself. There's nothing shady about it, ma'am." "Oh, really?" Margaret leaned forward, emphasizing each word with deliberate malice. "But I find that hard to believe. Try looking at yourself in the mirror. A black boy dressed like this, walking into a high-end store like ours, carrying a stack of cash. You don't think anyone's going to be suspicious?" Jalen froze for a moment. Margaret's words struck deep at a pain he had always tried to hide. He was all too familiar with being judged for his appearance and skin color, but hearing it so directly and maliciously, right to his face, made him feel suffocated. He forced himself to breathe evenly, slowly, looking Margaret straight in the eye as he calmly replied, "I don't think appearance or skin color should be used to judge a person. I just want to buy this item. I have no intention of causing any trouble." "Not causing trouble?" Margaret repeated his words mockingly, her gaze now filled with open contempt. "Boy, your very presence here is already a problem." The atmosphere in the store seemed to freeze after that biting remark. Other customers began to pay more attention. A few whispering and wary looks turned toward Jalen with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Jalen felt his face burning, but he still refused to let himself crumble. He knew very well that, at this moment, just one unrestrained action, one rash word, would shatter everything. And when that happened, all of his hard work, his small dream, and the self-respect he had fought so hard to maintain would mean nothing in the eyes of people like Margaret. But Margaret didn't seem to want to stop there. She leaned forward, looking at Jalen with a challenging gaze, and coldly delivered her final words. "If you really want to buy that bracelet, you'd better remember your place. A person like you walks in here carrying suspicious cash like that. It's no wonder people have to be on guard. And honestly, I don't want my store to become a place for small-time criminals to try their luck." Her words were a direct, crushing blow to Jalen's dignity. Any explanation now seemed meaningless in the face of the deep-rooted prejudice embedded in this woman's mind. He stood there, his hands clenched so tightly they were shaking, every breath coming with effort. In the suffocating air, Jalen realized that the fight against societal prejudice was far harsher than he had ever imagined. But he wouldn't give up, not easily at least. But what Jalen didn't know was that this was only the beginning of a much grimmer chain of events that awaited him ahead. In the moment when the heavy atmosphere still enveloped the store, Jalen took a deep breath, determined not to let Margaret's harsh words defeat him. He gently reached for the silver bracelet again, hoping that completing the transaction quickly would allow him to escape the suffocating situation. However, it was at that very moment that an unexpected disaster struck. Jalen's hand, usually steady, began to tremble uncontrollably, thanks to the sharp insults he had just endured. And as he lifted the bracelet from the counter, it slipped from his fingers, as though an invisible force had yanked it away. The bracelet fell onto the glass surface with a sharp clink before bouncing onto the hard tile floor, rolling a few times before coming to a halt. The entire store suddenly fell into a heavy silence. Jalen stood frozen to the spot, his heart pounding, eyes wide with fear. He was about to bend down to pick up the bracelet, but Margaret reacted quicker, like she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. "Oh my God, I knew it!" Margaret shouted, her voice rising dramatically, causing all the customers to turn and look. "You were trying to steal the bracelet. I can see it now. Someone call the police." Margaret's malicious accusation echoed through the store like a bomb going off, creating a shockwave that quickly spread. Customers jumped in surprise, murmuring amongst themselves, their suspicious and accusatory gazes immediately turning toward Jalen. They looked at him as if he were a criminal, none of them bothering to verify the truth behind Margaret's words. Jalen shook his head repeatedly, his voice trembling as he desperately tried to explain, his heart nearly bursting from the panic. "No, that's not it. I just dropped it by accident. I wasn't trying to steal anything." But Margaret stepped out from behind the counter, pointing a finger at Jalen, her face triumphant and full of deep disdain. "You still dare to deny it? I had a feeling from the moment you walked in here. Suspicious cash, shady attitude. Now your true face is showing." Margaret's words cut into Jalen's dignity like a sharp knife. He felt hopeless, searching for any sympathy from those around him, but all he received were cold, indifferent stares. A few customers even took a small step back, keeping their distance as if he were a dangerous threat. Margaret quickly moved to the counter, grabbed her phone, and with a voice full of agitation and hatred, called the police. "There's a thief trying to steal something from my store. Yes, Belmont Jewelers, right in the center of Riverton. Get here immediately. He's still standing here, a black teenager in a hoodie, looking very suspicious. I'm afraid he'll try to run." Margaret's voice was dramatic and sharp, deliberately loud enough for everyone in the store to hear the accusation clearly. The surrounding customers began whispering more loudly, their fear and curiosity spreading quickly like wildfire. Jalen stood motionless, his body shaking, his heart sinking. He realized that his words no longer mattered. That small, accidental mistake had been twisted by Margaret into evidence against him, a perfect piece of proof for the cruel prejudices that had been embedded in her mind. Margaret hung up the phone, her cold eyes locking onto Jalen with clear satisfaction and a challenge, as if she were a hunter who had just captured her prey. "The police will be here soon. Don't even think about trying to escape." Jalen bit his lip, his eyes stinging, but he forced himself not to cry. He knew that one rash move now would only make everything worse. Instead, he straightened his back, kept his trembling hands at his sides, and looked Margaret in the eye, his voice steady as he clung to the last bit of calm he had. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm innocent, and I'll prove it." Margaret merely sneered, as if his words were the most meaningless thing in the world. The atmosphere inside Belmont Jewelers was now as tense as a tightly pulled string, with the surrounding eyes still cold, skeptical, and judgmental, unwilling to listen to the truth from a black teenager standing helplessly in the midst of a sea of prejudice. The sound of a police siren grew louder in the distance, each moment bringing it closer, like a hammer pounding away at Jalen's last shred of dignity and trust. He stood there, his heart aching, silently wishing for a miracle to happen, but also bracing himself for the harsh and unfair battle that awaited him ahead. The sound of the police sirens grew louder, echoing like an ominous sign for what was about to happen to Jalen. He stood frozen in the middle of Belmont Jewelers, trying to keep his breathing steady, but his heart was pounding heavily in his chest, weighed down by desperation and confusion. He could feel every pair of eyes around him locked onto him, cold, wary, and full of disdain. The customers who had been intently examining the sparkling jewelry just moments ago now turned their gaze to Jalen, as if he had just removed his harmless mask and revealed himself as a dangerous criminal. A middle-aged woman quickly pulled her expensive handbag closer to her body, her eyes watching him warily. A man standing nearby shook his head slightly, whispering something to his wife, but just loud enough for Jalen to hear the words, "Just as I thought." The shadow of prejudice was now engulfing Jalen, stronger and clearer than ever. The people around him no longer saw him as an innocent teenager. Instead, he was instantly labeled as a thief, a potential threat, all because of his appearance and skin color. Jalen helplessly scanned the store, searching for even the slightest bit of sympathy, but all he found were cold, suspicious stares. No one spoke up to defend him, and no one dared step forward to verify the truth. Meanwhile, Margaret stood proudly beside the counter, her chin held high, lips tightly pressed in a triumphant smile, as if she had just won some important battle. When two police officers quickly entered the store, the atmosphere became even more tense. One of the officers, Sergeant Blake, tall and with cold, piercing eyes, moved quickly to Margaret, asking in a professional tone, though laced with blind trust, "What's going on here, Mrs. Whitmore?" Margaret immediately pointed at Jalen, her voice rising in excitement, deliberately making the story sound larger than it was. "It's him. He came into my store pretending to want to buy something, then purposely dropped the bracelet to distract me. He clearly meant to steal it. I saw everything with my own eyes." Blake immediately looked at Jalen, his stern, cold gaze suggesting that Margaret's accusation was the most concrete evidence in the world. Without hesitation, and with no intention of verifying the facts, he moved quickly toward Jalen, his voice authoritative and threatening. "You step still and raise your hands." Jalen flinched, his eyes wide with terror. He tried to remain calm, his voice trembling but sincere as he attempted to explain. "Officer, I didn't do anything wrong. I just dropped the bracelet by accident. I wasn't trying to steal anything." Blake furrowed his brows, his expression giving no indication that he would believe Jalen. Instead, the younger officer accompanying him, Officer Doyle, seemed to hesitate slightly, his gaze faltering for a moment. But soon, the pressure and suspicion from those around them caused Doyle to turn away, avoiding Jalen's desperate look. "You think this explanation is going to convince anyone?" Blake said coldly, laced with sarcasm. "We got a clear call, and Mrs. Whitmore here is a reliable witness. Do you have anything else to say?" Jalen stood motionless, his hands shaking as he raised them as ordered, tears welling up in his eyes, but he fought them back, determined not to let them fall. He swallowed hard, gathering what little strength he had left to plead once more. "I'm truly innocent. Please, check the security cameras. You'll see I didn't steal anything." Margaret quickly interjected, her voice sharp as a knife. "Cameras? It's as clear as day. No need to waste time. I saw it with my own eyes." Blake nodded in agreement with Margaret, without hesitation or further questioning. The prejudice in his mind seemed to have already decided everything. He pulled out his handcuffs, moving toward Jalen and coldly commanding, "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." The surrounding people held their breath, some whispering louder, their eyes filled with curiosity and disdain, all focused on Jalen. The darkness of prejudice now grew thicker, completely overshadowing the truth and the sincere words of an innocent teenager. Jalen stood there, his body trembling, every muscle tensed. In this moment of despair, he knew better than ever. He was caught in an unfair fight, where the truth and his honesty couldn't withstand the deeply ingrained societal prejudice. The only thing Jalen could do now was try to stay calm, not letting fear completely take over, and hope for some miracle before it was too late. But deep down, he understood more than ever. The cruel social prejudice and its darkness had rendered him powerless, alone in the battle to defend himself. As Officer Blake approached closer, the handcuffs gleaming in his hand like a cold, ruthless sentence, Jalen felt his body go numb from fear. He unconsciously took a small step back, his heart pounding as if it were trying to escape his chest. To the onlookers, this action was immediately interpreted as resistance. The air in Belmont Jewelers grew more suffocating than ever, with everyone tense, watching every tiny movement closely. "Stay still!" Blake shouted, his eyes cold and threatening. "The more you resist, the worse this will get for you." I'm not resisting," Jalen stammered, his voice choking on fear and helplessness. "I just want to explain. Please, just listen to me once." But Blake had no patience left to listen. He quickly moved forward, gripping Jalen's wrist with force, turning him around to handcuff him behind his back. The cold, metallic touch of the handcuffs on Jalen's wrists drained the last of his strength. "Wait," Doyle, the younger officer, suddenly spoke up, his face filled with hesitation as he took a small step forward, seeming to want to intervene. Maybe he just dropped it by accident. We should check the security footage before. Blake immediately cut him off, glaring at Doyle with authority, his voice cold as he warned, "Doyle, you're still new at this. You need to trust my experience. Clear witness, clear evidence. What's there to doubt?" Doyle fell silent immediately, casting a quick apologetic glance at Jalen before stepping back a few paces, his head lowered, unwilling to say anything further. Doyle's indecision and cowardice only deepened Jalen's pain and despair, as even the one person who had shown any doubt was too afraid to stand with him. Margaret, watching the entire scene unfold, couldn't hide the gleam of satisfaction in her eyes. She crossed her arms, leaning back against the counter, enjoying the feeling of victory and power she had just gained from her malicious accusations. To Margaret, the teenager before her wasn't worth a shred of sympathy. In this moment, cornered and desperate, Jalen knew that if he continued to stay silent and submissive, he would be swept into an inescapable cycle of injustice. Society's prejudice had turned a small, accidental moment into a life-or-death crisis, with him as the only one bearing the consequences. Despite the cold, indifferent looks from all sides, Jalen gathered every last bit of strength, trembling as he spoke. "Please, can I make a phone call? I'm begging you." Blake frowned in irritation but reluctantly nodded, seeing it as a small concession before Jalen was taken to the police station. Jalen slowly pulled out his phone, his hands shaking so much that he almost couldn't press the familiar numbers. The phone rang, each beep feeling like a sharp knife cutting deeper into Jalen's mind. Finally, the deep, familiar voice of his father, Dominic Carter, the most notorious crime boss in Riverton, came through, full of authority. Jalen? What's going on, son? Dad, can you come to Belmont Jewelers right now? Jalen almost choked on his words, his voice full of desperation and pleading. They're accusing me of stealing. The police want to arrest me. I need your help. Right now. Hearing his son's panicked plea, Dominic's voice immediately turned cold and sharp like steel. Don't worry about anything. I'm coming right now. As Jalen hung up the phone, Blake shot him a disdainful, indifferent look, as though the phone call had been nothing more than a useless delay. Done? Let's go. No matter who your father is, you still have to answer to the law. Jalen lowered his head in silence, no longer resisting. Inside, a flicker of hope rose, but it was also coupled with overwhelming fear. He knew exactly who his father was, knew the power and terror behind the name Dominic Carter. But at the same time, he also understood that once that powerful Mafia boss stepped into this store, everything would change completely. None of the people in the store, especially Margaret and the two officers, could ever have imagined that the innocent teenager they were oppressing, judging and accusing so coldly, was the son of the most dangerous man in the city. And as the glass door of Belmont Jewelers was about to open once again, none of those standing there, from Margaret to Blake, were aware that the prejudice they held against Jalen would soon face the full force of a dark and terrifying power they had never dared to imagine. As the air in the store reached its most suffocating point, Officer Blake was about to escort Jalen to the car when the glass door of Belmont Jewelers suddenly swung open with a powerful, sharp sound, immediately drawing everyone's attention. A tall man entered first, his muscular frame draped in a sharp black suit, exuding a dangerous power that was unmistakable. Right behind him, 4 other men stepped in, their faces cold as ice, their eyes sharp as knives, clearly professional bodyguards ready to act at any moment. The atmosphere in the store immediately seemed to freeze under the weight of this overwhelming presence. Jalen looked up, a mix of relief and fear flooding through him. The man who had just entered was none other than his father, Dominic Carter, the most powerful and feared Mafia boss in all of Riverton. Dominic's cold eyes quickly scanned the store, and with just one glance he silenced everyone, making their hearts stop. Margaret, who had been standing with pride and arrogance just moments ago, now lost all composure. Her face went pale, her lips trembling, and her eyes widened in shock as she realized who had just entered. The dark power that Dominic exuded was something she could neither face nor control. Officer Blake immediately recognized who had entered the store. He took a small step back instinctively, his body tensing. The handcuffs that were still tightly around Jalen's wrists now seemed completely irrelevant. Officer Doyle, even paler, stood frozen, his legs trembling, too afraid to even look up. Dominic Carter slowly walked toward Jalen, each step he took carrying an invisible pressure that made everyone present hold their breath. When he stopped in front of his son, Dominic placed a gentle hand on Jalen's shoulder, a protective gesture that was both solid and frightening. His gaze then shifted toward Blake, his voice cold and calm as he asked, "What are you doing to my son?" Dominic's voice was soft yet heavy with power, each word he spoke making the listener feel as though they were standing on the edge of a cliff. Blake swallowed hard, struggling to maintain his composure as his voice shook. "Mr. Carter, we received a call reporting that this boy tried to steal something from the store. We were just doing our duty." "Steal?" Dominic interrupted Blake sharply, his eyes slowly turning toward Margaret. "Who dared to accuse my son of stealing?" Margaret felt her heart drop to the floor, her eyes wide with fear as she met Dominic's deadly gaze. At that moment, she realized the serious mistake she had made. She had unknowingly crossed a line that no one dared cross, and now the consequences were clear before her eyes. I, Margaret stammered, her arrogance completely gone, replaced with frantic panic. I misunderstood. I am truly sorry. Dominic slowly moved closer to Margaret, his voice dropping even lower, his sharp gaze filled with threat, but still maintaining a chilling calm. Misunderstood? Do you have any idea how serious your misunderstanding is? You dared to insult and falsely accuse my son in front of everyone. Do you think I'll just let this go? Margaret shakily took a step back, her back hitting the counter, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk as if she were about to collapse. The other customers stood frozen like statues, none daring to move. They all knew who Dominic Carter was and understood that he never joked. Officer Blake, now completely devoid of his earlier confidence, weakly tried to salvage the situation. Mr. Carter, this is clearly a huge misunderstanding. We will immediately review the security footage and clear everything up. Dominic didn't respond to Blake immediately. He turned to look at Jalen, his expression softening just a little, though still carrying the strength of a father who was ready to protect his son at all costs. Jalen, are you okay? I'm fine. Dad, Jalen whispered, his voice still trembling but now a little steadier, knowing his father was standing here. Dominic turned back to Blake and Doyle, his voice cold and resolute, like a verdict already sealed. I hope you understand how gravely you've just wronged my family. The security footage doesn't matter anymore. You better handle this properly. Blake and Doyle both fell silent, their heads lowered, too afraid to argue. Margaret stood still as if paralyzed, her face ashen, fully aware that her fate had completely changed since Dominic Carter had entered the store. The atmosphere in Belmont Jewelers was no longer just tense. It had turned into a true nightmare for Margaret and the two officers, those who had made the gravest mistake of crossing the boundaries of a Mafia boss with unimaginable power in this city. The atmosphere inside Belmont Jewelers was thick with an eerie silence. Dominic Carter scanned the room, finally stopping at Margaret. His gaze was cold and sharp, but also laced with a dangerous hint of mockery. Miss Margaret, is that right? Dominic spoke, his voice deep and commanding, causing everyone to flinch. Could you explain to me exactly why you called the police on my son? Margaret stood frozen, as if her feet were nailed to the floor, trembling uncontrollably. The arrogance she had moments ago had completely vanished, replaced by pure panic. She tried to speak, but her voice trembled so much that it was barely audible. I honestly thought he was trying to steal the bracelet. I didn't know he was your son. I truly apologize, Mr. Carter, ... Dominic smirked coldly, his eyes fixed on Margaret as if he were a predator toying with prey caught in its jaws. He took a step closer, making Margaret flinch and back away into the counter, her trembling hand desperately gripping the glass surface. So, you're admitting that you accused my son of stealing based on baseless suspicion? Dominic's voice was chilling. I wonder how many other innocent teens have had to suffer this kind of false accusation from you before. Margaret swallowed hard, her face growing even paler, her lips quivering. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The fear enveloped her, and she now fully realized she was facing the consequences of her own cruel biases and arrogance. Officer Blake quickly stepped forward, his voice shaky but trying to sound firm. Mr. Carter, we were simply following up on the report we received. We had no idea he was your son. We'll handle this immediately. Please rest assured. Dominic shot Blake a look of utter disdain, silencing him instantly. The air around Dominic seemed to thicken with power and danger, making Blake's explanation feel utterly insignificant. "Officer Blake, is it?" Dominic asked slowly, his voice sending a chill down everyone's spine. "You didn't ask for the full story, you didn't check the evidence, and you immediately decided to handcuff my son. I'm curious, do you often act so unprofessionally?" I didn't mean to," Blake stammered, the confidence he usually carried vanishing into thin air. "I just trusted Ms. Margaret's testimony." Dominic let out a small laugh, the sound full of mockery and contempt. "Oh, really? The world is strange. An experienced officer like you would rely on the biased testimony of a store employee to decide that an innocent teenager is a criminal. Makes me wonder, did you just see a black boy and immediately think he must have committed a crime?" The words struck Blake like a sharp knife, slicing into his pride. The older officer fell silent, his head lowered, his hands clenched with tension. He was completely powerless, knowing that any justification now would be meaningless in front of the overwhelming dark power standing before him. Dominic stepped even closer to Blake, his voice dropping lower, each word carrying the weight of a terrifying warning. "I want you to understand something clearly, Blake. For now, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt and assume this was just a regrettable mistake on your part. But if you ever dare to touch my family again, I assure you, the consequences will be so severe you won't be able to imagine." Blake trembled, his head bowing even lower, too afraid to meet Dominic's cold, sharp gaze. Officer Doyle, standing behind him, could feel each word Dominic spoke as a cold blade against his throat, terrified to move. Dominic turned back to Margaret for one last look. His gaze grew darker, sharper than ever, full of threat. "And you, Margaret, I'll be sure to remember your name. I hope you understand the consequences of falsely accusing my son. I don't like repeating myself." Margaret froze, her face turning white as a sheet, sweat pouring down her forehead. She could already imagine the dreadful future awaiting her. Dominic's words felt like a death sentence, making her understand that her life would never be the same again. The atmosphere in the store turned to a deathly silence as Dominic returned to Jalen's side, placing a firm, protective hand on his son's shoulder. He scanned the room once more, his voice low but powerful, filled with authority. "I trust that everyone here now understands how they should behave, especially when dealing with the family of Dominic Carter." The final warning echoed like distant thunder, sending chills down the spines of Margaret, Blake, Doyle, and all the witnesses. It was the moment when all of them realized they had narrowly escaped a deadly disaster, yet simultaneously understood that their lives would never be the same again. As Dominic's final words hung in the air, the store fell into a terrifying silence. The onlookers didn't dare breathe too loudly, as if any small movement might make them the next target of this powerful, intimidating man. Dominic slowly turned back around, his cold eyes locking onto Margaret once again. His voice now became sharp and decisive. "Miss Margaret, is that correct?" Dominic spoke, his deep voice carrying such authority that it made everyone jump. "Before I leave, I want to see the so-called evidence you have used to falsely accuse my son. Margaret, I think it's time for you to show us the security footage of this store, unless you have something to hide." Margaret swallowed hard, her trembling hand pressing against her chest, trying to contain her panic. She knew very well that checking the footage was exactly what she had been avoiding all along, because deep down, she knew Jalen was completely innocent. But now, standing in front of Dominic Carter's cold demand, she had no choice but to comply. I will get the security footage right away," Margaret mumbled, her voice shaking so much it was nearly inaudible. She slowly turned and made her way to the small office at the back of the store. Every step felt heavier, as if each one was pulling her closer to the bitter conclusion she had brought upon herself. Fear gripped Margaret's heart because she knew the video she was about to show would expose the truth and bury her in the very mistakes born of her own biased actions. Just a few minutes later, Margaret returned, her hand trembling as she handed Officer Doyle the USB drive containing the footage. Doyle quickly plugged the USB into the small computer at the counter. The entire store held its breath, watching the screen with bated anticipation, and the tension thickened in the air. The security footage began to play, clearly showing every second since Jalen entered the store. It was all there. Jalen politely standing at the counter, politely requesting to see the silver bracelet. Margaret had clearly been suspicious from the beginning. Then, when the bracelet accidentally slipped from Jalen's hand and fell to the floor, the footage showed what everyone had already seen: a small accident, with no sinister actions or intentions of theft at all. As the truth became undeniably clear on the screen, Margaret felt as if all the blood in her body had drained out. Her face turned as white as paper, her eyes wide with terror as she realized the disastrous mistake she had made. The scariest part for her wasn't just the mistake itself, but the fact that she had unknowingly crossed a line no one dared to. Dominic Carter, the Mafia boss with a terrifying reputation beyond anything she had ever imagined. Dominic smirked, his eyes as cold as ice as he looked at Margaret. His voice rang out like an inescapable verdict. "So, now the truth is clear, isn't it, Margaret? Do you have anything else to say?" Margaret trembled violently, her whole body stiffening. The confidence and arrogance she had shown earlier were completely gone, replaced by sheer terror. She tried to speak, but her throat closed up from fear and shame. I didn't mean to. I truly apologize. I just misunderstood." Dominic let out a small, cold laugh, full of contempt and danger. "Misunderstood? A smart woman like you, easily misunderstanding to the point of ruining an innocent teenager's future? How disappointing, Margaret." Both officers Blake and Doyle stood stunned, their eyes glued to the video in shock and shame. Blake clenched his fists, his jaw tightening in anger at the careless prejudice that had led him to make such a grave mistake. Doyle, on the other hand, only lowered his head, clearly too afraid to face the truth unfolding before him. Dominic turned his gaze to Blake, his eyes colder and more stern than ever. "Blake, I hope you're wise enough to understand what you need to do about this. A police officer like you, unable to distinguish right from wrong, should seriously reconsider whether you're sitting in the right position." Blake remained completely silent, his head bowed even lower, overwhelmed by shame and fear. The older officer understood that Dominic's words were not empty threats. They were a serious warning from a man capable of destroying his life and career with a single phone call. Margaret stood against the counter, her face still ashen, cold sweat running down her forehead. She knew she had entered a battle she couldn't possibly win, a battle she had started herself. The truth was now so clear that she couldn't deny it any longer. Dominic finally turned back to Jalen, his expression softening just a bit, but still as sharp as ever. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder and softly said, "Let's go, Jalen. There's nothing left for you to concern yourself with here." Dominic led Jalen out of the store, leaving behind a silence filled with fear from everyone present. The shadow of his power and coldness slowly disappeared behind the glass door, leaving a chilling, oppressive atmosphere in its wake. A storm that Margaret and all those involved would have to endure the long-term consequences of. As soon as Dominic and Jalen disappeared behind the glass door, the tension in the store remained palpable, growing even heavier and more suffocating. The people in Belmont Jewelers stood motionless, as if they hadn't yet recovered from the confrontation that had just taken place. But everyone understood that the real consequences had only just begun. Outside the glass door, Dominic Carter briefly cast a sharp glance at one of his most trusted men, a subtle and brief signal, but enough for the man to understand what the next task was. The cold-faced man nodded slightly, stepped back a few paces, and quickly disappeared into the bustling crowd outside. Inside the store, Margaret remained frozen, her face ashen with no blood left in it, her breathing growing erratic with panic. She knew all too well that her life from this moment on would never be the same. Just because of a moment of bias, arrogance, and a grave mistake, she had lost everything. Her job, her dignity, and the future she had worked so hard to build for many years. And just as she predicted, her phone in her pocket suddenly vibrated, shattering the eerie silence. She shakily pulled it out, and the screen displayed the number of the store manager, the one she had always tried to impress. Margaret swallowed hard, pressed the answer button, and immediately the cold, threatening voice of the manager came through. "Margaret, we know what just happened. I think you understand that the store can't withstand this kind of scandal. From now on, you no longer work at Belmont Jewelers. Everything related to you will be dealt with immediately." Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but the line went dead abruptly, leaving her no chance to explain herself. She stood motionless, trembling, fully aware that Dominic Carter had silently acted, and with just a word or subtle gesture, he had easily destroyed her life in an instant. Margaret glanced around the store once more, but now no one looked at her with sympathy. They all regarded her with clear disdain and coldness, as though she had become something vile and to be avoided. She struggled to maintain her balance, but her legs felt as if they could no longer bear the weight of the shame she was carrying. At the same time, Blake and Doyle stood near the door, as if they had just woken from a long stupor. Blake took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure, but his heart sank when his phone rang, displaying his superior's number. Blake sluggishly answered, hearing the sharp, angry voice of his commander on the other end. "Blake, what have you done? Do you have any idea who you've just messed with? This mistake isn't just embarrassing for the police department, it's going to cause us serious trouble. I want to see you immediately when you get back to the station. Prepare yourself for the consequences of what you've done." Blake remained silent, his face pale, cold sweat soaking through the back of his shirt. He understood the gravity of what his superior had said. The career he had worked so hard to build could be shattered just because of his blind prejudice and thoughtless actions today. Blake tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat, knowing full well that any attempt at an explanation would now be meaningless. After the call ended, Blake looked at Officer Doyle, who was still bowing his head in silence, his eyes full of helplessness and fear. Blake knew that it wasn't just him who would suffer the consequences of this incident. Even Doyle, the young officer, would bear a significant burden from this mistake. What had seemed like a small error had now become an indelible stain on their careers. Meanwhile, Margaret still stood motionless, like a soulless shadow, tears now streaming down her face. She understood that no matter how much she cried, it was too late. A single moment of misjudgment, a decision made in blind bias, and everything she had worked for had vanished into thin air before the terrifying power of Dominic Carter. Outside the store, Dominic's trusted man nodded slightly when he saw that Margaret had completely broken down. He immediately pulled out his phone, making a brief call with a cold voice. "It's done, Mr. Carter. She won't be causing trouble anymore." Dominic Carter smirked with satisfaction as he heard the brief report from his man, but his gaze remained as cold as ever. For him, dealing with people like Margaret or Blake was trivial, but anyone who dared touch his family would pay a very steep price. Dominic's luxury car rolled away, leaving Belmont Jewelers behind, sinking into an atmosphere of gloom, coldness, panic, and unease. Margaret, Blake, and Doyle all understood that what they had just faced wasn't just the harsh consequences of a mistake. It was the terrifying power, beyond their imagination, of Riverton's most feared Mafia boss. As Dominic and Jalen's luxury car slowly pulled away from Belmont Jewelers, blending into the busy flow of traffic on the streets of Riverton, Jalen leaned his head against the window, his gaze distant as he stared outside. The images of what had just happened continued to swirl in his mind, clear and sharp to the point of pain. Dominic sat beside him, glancing at his son subtly. He remained silent, but it was clear he was contemplating every thought racing through Jalen's mind at that moment. Dominic knew his son well. Jalen, sensitive and always striving to prove himself, had been deeply hurt by what had transpired, more than anyone else could see. Jalen closed his eyes for a moment, trying to calm the chaotic feelings inside him, but it was in vain. The pain was steadily growing in his chest, sharper and more uncomfortable than anything he had ever felt. Though he had been cleared in front of everyone, Jalen knew deep down that his innocence had not come from real justice, but from the terrifying power of his father. He had hoped to walk into that store as just an ordinary teenager, buying a simple gift for his sister with money he had earned on his own. But all those innocent hopes had shattered in an instant when he faced Margaret's contemptuous gaze, the malicious suspicion from Officer Blake, and the cold indifference from everyone around him. In that moment, Jalen realized that he had never truly been seen fairly. People only saw his skin color, his simple clothes, and quickly judged him as suspicious. The truth had become irrelevant, and social prejudice had overwhelmed everything. "Dad," finally, Jalen spoke softly, breaking the heavy silence in the car. His voice was quiet, but filled with emotion. "If I weren't your son, would I still be treated fairly?" Dominic was silent for a few seconds, his gaze becoming more serious than ever. He understood that Jalen had asked a difficult question, because the truth was, without his power, Jalen would have had an incredibly hard time proving his innocence in such a situation. "Jalen," Dominic replied quietly, his voice still deep and stern, but laced with a hint of concern. "This world is always unfair. That's why power is so important. You've seen it yourself. Sometimes real justice doesn't just come naturally." Jalen turned to look at his father, his eyes filled with clear disappointment and hurt. Although his father's words were sincere, they felt bitter to him. What Jalen had always dreamed of was a society where people judged him based on who he was, not on his skin color or the power behind him. But today, he saw clearly that dream might just be an unattainable luxury. "But Dad, I don't want to live off your power my whole life," Jalen said softly, his voice trembling with emotion. "I just want to live true to myself, to be respected as a normal person. But they've never given me that chance." Dominic looked deeply into his son's eyes, and for the first time in his life, he felt powerless in a situation where even his supreme power couldn't fully change the outcome. He understood that, no matter how powerful he was, it couldn't erase the deep-rooted prejudices in others. "I know what you want, Jalen, but sometimes life doesn't give us another choice," Dominic replied gently, though his eyes remained sharp as ever. "This world is too harsh. If you don't have strength, it will consume you forever." Jalen fell silent, turning away, his gaze once again fixed on the streets fading behind them. In his heart, there was both a bitter feeling and a deep sense of helplessness. He knew his father's words weren't wrong. The world was indeed cruel, and his father's power had saved him from an unjust fate. But that very fact hurt him more, as he realized he had never been seen in a fair and rightful way. The car continued driving in silence. The atmosphere between father and son grew more distant, not because they didn't understand each other, but because both of them were painfully aware of their powerlessness in a world so harsh and unjust. And although Dominic had succeeded in clearing his son's name deep inside, he knew that the hurt Jalen had endured today would linger in his heart forever, like an invisible scar that no amount of power, no matter how great, could ever heal. The atmosphere inside the car remained deeply tense, the only sound being the smooth hum of the engine and the soft yet heavy breaths of Dominic and Jalen. Dominic slowly turned his gaze toward his son, a hint of concern in his expression, an emotion that was rare for a notorious Mafia boss like him. "Jalen," Dominic said gently, his voice a little softer this time, but still carrying the familiar authority. "I know you've endured a lot today, but sometimes these bitter experiences are what make us stronger." Jalen furrowed his brow and turned to look at his father with eyes full of sadness and frustration. He could feel his father's attempt to comfort him, but he also felt the deep disconnect in their perspectives on life. Dominic always saw power and strength as necessary weapons for survival, but Jalen couldn't disagree more. "I don't think like you do, Dad," Jalen said quietly, his voice bitter and filled with emotion. "I don't want to become strong in that way. Not through power, not through threats or the fear of others. I just want to live a normal life where I can be myself without relying on any forces behind me." Dominic paused for a moment, taken aback by his son's honest and straightforward words. Jalen's words pierced him, making him feel a pang of guilt. Dominic knew he had raised Jalen in a world full of power and violence, where justice was often written with money and influence, not fairness or righteousness. "Jalen, I understand what you want," Dominic replied, his voice steady, but his eyes hardening slightly. "But the world you're living in will never be fair. Without power and strength, you will always be a victim." "But Dad," Jalen choked, his eyes glistening with emotion, "if everyone thought like you, society would never change. It would stay this way forever. Today, if it weren't for your power, they would have treated me like a criminal. That's not justice, do you understand? It's just the protection that comes with power." Dominic fell silent, his eyes focused ahead, as though contemplating something deeply. He was used to solving problems with strength and authority, but hearing these sincere words from his own son made him waver. Just slightly, but enough to make him realize that a gap truly existed between him and his son. "I never wanted you to be hurt, Jalen," Dominic finally spoke after a pause, his voice softening just a little, but still full of strength. "But sometimes, to survive in this world, you have to know how to protect yourself at all costs, even if you don't like it." Jalen turned away, staring out the car window, his heart heavy with the conflict between love and disappointment for his father. He understood that Dominic wanted to protect him in his own way, with the terrifying power he possessed. But it was exactly this protection that made him feel more bitter than ever. "I don't want to live like that, Dad," Jalen replied softly, his voice calm but firm. "I just want people to see me as a normal person, not as the son of a powerful crime boss, not as someone protected by the dark forces you control. Your power might have saved me today, but it also hurts me more deeply because it reminds me that I can never be seen for who I truly am." Dominic glanced at Jalen once more, sensing the disappointment and pain in his son's voice. He wanted to say something else, but the words caught in his throat. Dominic was a man who wasn't accustomed to weakness or soft reassurances, but in this moment he understood that power and strength couldn't always heal the deep wounds inside a person. "I know you think I'm wrong, Jalen," Dominic finally spoke again, his voice heavy with thought. "But I want you to remember this. Whether you believe it or not, everything I've done is to protect you and the family. I chose this path a long time ago, and I can't turn back." The car continued to roll slowly down the familiar road toward home. Father and son sat side by side, but each was lost in their own thoughts and emotions. The silence between them grew more tense, not because of any fear in the silence itself, but because it reflected the profound difference between them. A man who had placed all his faith in the power of absolute strength, and a son who simply longed for a life of normalcy and real fairness. Jalen remained silent, staring out the window, his eyes filled with the deep, lingering hurt. He understood more than ever that the distance between him and his father had grown wider, not because they didn't love each other, but because they stood in two completely different worlds that seemed impossible to reconcile. As Dominic's car disappeared behind the gates of the mansion, the real storm at Belmont Jewelers had only just begun to spread. Just hours after the incident, security footage quickly surfaced on social media, spreading at a rapid pace. Thousands of people watched, commented, and shared, each comment filled with outrage and harsh criticism aimed squarely at Margaret and Officer Blake. In an instant, Margaret became the target of public fury throughout the city. Comments flooded the internet, condemning her as a racist, cruel, and shameless. Her personal life was thoroughly dug into, with everything about her being scrutinized and exposed online, from her past job to her private relationships. Her phone incessantly buzzed with anonymous calls and hateful messages. Within one night, Margaret lost everything: her job, her dignity, and even her self-belief. Belmont Jewelers, the once famous jewelry store, now became a direct victim of the incident. Calls for a boycott spread like wildfire on social media. Negative reviews flooded in, causing customers to turn away one by one. In just a few short days, the store that had once been bustling with customers was now eerily empty, and the revenue plummeted drastically. The owner had to issue a public apology and announce the complete severance of any ties with Margaret. Not only Margaret, but Officer Blake also became the target of public criticism. The security footage clearly showed that he had completely ignored basic investigative steps, hastily deciding to arrest Jalen based on bias and racial prejudice. The wave of anger immediately turned toward the Riverton Police Department, forcing them to issue a quick statement to calm the public. Under intense pressure from both the community and his superiors, Blake was forced to accept an indefinite suspension. The case was handed over to the Internal Affairs Department for investigation, marking a shameful moment in his long career. Each passing day, Blake felt as though he were living in a nightmare. The scrutinizing looks from colleagues, the coldness from friends, and the disappointed gazes from his family. Meanwhile, the media continued to exploit the event, quickly turning it into a symbol of social injustice and the long-standing racial discrimination present in the Riverton community. Television discussions and controversial articles flooded the airwaves, delving deeper into the inequality and prejudice still clearly evident in society. At home, Jalen sat quietly in his room, his sad eyes fixed on his phone screen displaying news about the incident. Though he had been cleared, his heart still weighed heavily with bitterness and deep disappointment. Jalen knew that it wasn't social justice or the truth that had saved him, it was his father's power. The knock on his door interrupted his wandering thoughts. Dominic opened the door and leaned against the frame, his eyes stern but gentler than usual. "Are you okay, Jalen?" Dominic asked softly, his voice filled with genuine concern, something rarely shown by a man like him. Jalen sighed, shaking his head lightly, his eyes still heavy with sorrow as he looked at his father. "Dad, everything may be over, but I don't feel relieved at all. I really don't want to see these consequences happen to anyone, even Margaret or Officer Blake, even though they were wrong. I just want society to change, not to get revenge like this." Dominic silently looked at his son, and for a moment he felt a slight tremor of doubt. For as long as he could remember, Dominic had viewed revenge and punishment as necessary, tools for deterrence. But Jalen's honest and profound words made him reconsider the values he had always lived by. "Sometimes harsh consequences are what make people realize where they went wrong, Jalen," Dominic replied, his voice calm but tinged with rare reflection. "The world doesn't change easily like you wish, but maybe you're right about one thing. Revenge isn't the answer to everything." Jalen looked at his father, a hint of surprise in his eyes. For the first time, he heard his father acknowledge that he might be wrong about something. That moment, however small, brought Jalen a sense of relief amidst the deep wounds inside him. But even so, the aftermath of the incident continued to spread, deeply affecting those involved. Margaret sank into a personal crisis. Blake struggled with his career falling apart, and Jalen, though innocent, still felt the deep hurt, knowing that his truth was protected not by justice, but by the power and influence of his father. The storm had passed, but its consequences would linger for a long time, becoming a painful lesson not only for those directly involved, but also a warning for the Riverton community about the deep-seated prejudices and persistent injustices that have long existed in society. The following days passed slowly, but the echoes of the incident at Belmont Jewelers still clung to Jalen like a deep wound that couldn't heal. Finally, the day of his sister Aaliyah's birthday arrived, and even though Jalen's heart was still heavy, he decided to push aside the dark emotions to ensure that his sister's joy wouldn't be overshadowed. That morning, Dominic gently knocked on Jalen's door, quietly placing a small, carefully wrapped box on the table. "Here's the bracelet you wanted to buy for Aaliyah," he said in his usual deep voice, though his gaze softened slightly, losing some of its usual coldness. "I thought you'd still want to give it to her yourself." Jalen looked at the small box on the table, a faint, forced smile appearing on his lips. He knew that this gift still carried the mark of his father's power, something he had never wanted. But Jalen also understood that Aaliyah deserved this little happiness, and he didn't want his own wounds to affect her. That evening, when the family gathered around the birthday cake adorned with glowing candles, Jalen gently opened the box and handed the small gift to Aaliyah. She squealed with delight, her eyes shining with happiness as she received the silver bracelet she had longed for. "Thank you so much, Jalen." Aaliyah hugged her brother tightly, her simple joy soothing a part of the sorrow in Jalen's heart. But as he looked at his sister's innocent smile, Jalen's heart again filled with bitterness. He couldn't forget that to have this warm moment, his father had used his power and influence, not fairness and justice, which he had always believed in. That night, after Aaliyah had fallen asleep, Jalen quietly sat by the window, his gaze lost in the starry night sky. His thoughts wandered endlessly in his mind. Clearly, his father's power had protected him from harm, but it couldn't heal the deep emotional scars caused by societal prejudice. In that quiet moment, Jalen understood more clearly than ever that true justice could never come from fear or power. It had to come from courage, righteousness, and a sincere desire to change society, and he realized that he himself would have to be part of that change. The soft footsteps of Dominic approached from behind, cutting through Jalen's deep thoughts. He came closer, his eyes focused on the night sky, and after a moment of silence, spoke in his usual deep voice. "Jalen, I know you're still hurting, but remember, sometimes, to achieve justice, you need power too." Jalen turned to look at his father, his gaze serious and determined. For the first time, he truly felt like he had grown up. "Dad, power and authority only make people afraid, but they never change the deep-seated thoughts or prejudices inside them. I understand that you've protected me in your way, but from now on, I want to follow my own path, one where I can protect others with courage, fairness, not with power or violence." Dominic was momentarily surprised by his son's firm words, but deep within his eyes a small spark of pride seemed to flicker. He gently placed his strong hand on Jalen's shoulder, nodding slowly. "I respect your decision, Jalen. Maybe you're right. There are things power can never touch." Jalen looked deeply into his father's eyes, and for the first time, he felt a subtle understanding bridge the gap between them. Despite their differences in perspective, at least now his father understood and accepted that he wanted to choose a different path. A path not based on fear or dark power, but on courage, justice, and true compassion. The next day, Jalen woke up with a stronger resolve than ever. He would use the bitter experiences he had just gone through as motivation to start a new journey. A journey to change society's perception of racial discrimination and injustice. Not through power or threats like his father, but through courage, righteousness, and meaningful actions for the community. The path he chose might not be easy. It could be long and full of challenges. But Jalen believed that, with enough strength and determination, one day he would truly create change. And when that day came, the true value of justice would no longer depend on power or any dark force, but would come from kindness and fairness within each person. As he stepped out of his small room into the morning sunlight, Jalen felt lighter than ever. He knew that, despite the deep wounds, he had at least found true meaning in everything that had happened. A new journey beginning today, with the courage to create a fairer, kinder world, free of prejudice. That, he realized, was the true value of justice he would pursue. A justice that came from the heart, protected by the strength of belief and courage. Jalen's story wasn't just about a brave teenager overcoming prejudice. It was also a profound wake-up call about the social injustices that still exist around us. Prejudice and racism, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently, always leave deep scars that are hard to heal in people's hearts. What about you? If you were Jalen, would you choose to protect yourself with power, or stand up for justice with courage and righteousness? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video. Share it with friends to spread the powerful message of justice and courage. Subscribe to the channel to never miss the next meaningful story. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.